sudden illness, a tragic death, a natural disaster, a job loss. Everyone who faces calamity asks, why? Our races of life are often marked by unexplained events. The eye of faith looks forward to a future reckoning of all accounts, a time when the why questions get answers. To find out more about that future time, stay with us. From Chicago's Moody Church, this is Running to Win with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, whose clear teaching helps us make it across the finish line. Today, the final message in our series, What is God Up To, begins. Erwin Lutzer has a heavenly vantage point as he takes a look back at planet Earth.
I've entitled the message today, Looking Back on Planet Earth. Because someday when we're in heaven, we'll be able to look back upon this earth and understand more fully than we understand today what God was up to through 10,000 years of church history. I think that once we are in heaven, if we can see planet Earth from heaven, and I assume we'll be able to, we'll be impressed, first of all, with the tiny size of this planet in comparison to the vastness of the solar system and the stellar universe. And we will again be amazed that God should choose this small planet to be the one, to be that stage upon which good and evil and justice and injustice is played out. And we will be overwhelmed by the fact that we had a small part in that drama. Then I think, secondly, we'll be impressed also with the shortness of time. 8,000 years, 10,000 years seems to be a long time, and if you live 80 years, it can seem to be a long time. But once we're into eternity, we will be overwhelmed with the shortness of time in comparison to an eternity that has no end. And we will be swept up in the incredible grandeur of eternity. But I suppose that when we're there in heaven, one of the things we're going to do is to finally get a chance to ask God the question that plagues the minds of anybody who's ever done any thinking at all, and that is the question, why? Why all the suffering on planet Earth? Why all the grief? Why all the earthquakes? Why all the tragedies? Why all the heartaches? Why all the broken families? Oh, God, what were you up to? Before I try to answer that question, let me just take a moment to walk with you through the pages of history. Remember, after Adam and Eve were created, then generations began to come about, and those generations turned away from the Lord, and in turning from God, they began to serve pagan idols. And the whole world was so corrupt with its immorality and its cruelty that God says, I'm going to start over. All that he had left was Noah and his family. And so a flood came on the earth. We read that too quickly in the pages of the Bible. Have you ever thought of what a universal flood would mean? Here are families being swept away as the rain begins to pour, and they go to higher ground, and finally little children see their mommies and daddies being taken away by the fast, thoughtless, harsh current. And they're gone. And the children are crying, and they're weeping, and they're shrieking, and they're crying out to God. And the rain doesn't stop until every single human being is drowned. And God starts over. But you read about Noah, and soon you find that he also was involved, he and his ancestors involved in turning away from God. So you have the whole Babylonian Empire that begins with its occultism. And remember that whenever you have occultism, you always have cruelty. That's why as the United States swings toward the occultism of the New Age movement, cruelty, barbarianism will always increase. And so during that period of time, you have many wars. You have one nation conquering another nation. You have brutality on a scale that you and I have never seen. And generation goes after generation, and the knowledge of the true God is practically non-existent upon the earth. God decides to choose Abraham. And Abraham becomes the father, of course, of the Jewish nation. And you know that through the life of Abraham, God began that nation, but when you stop to think of it, Israel was a small nation in comparison to all the other nations of the earth, for one thing. And even within the nation Israel, there were relatively few who really knew the living and the true God. Most of the people ended up just going through the formality. They were not necessarily God's people in their hearts at all. And then after Jesus Christ comes to earth, when He's here, how many people really do believe on Him? Yes, a few hundred. Yes, a few thousand. But what about the nations that were developing, such as China? Years ago, my family and I were in China, and we stood upon the wall of China and were told that much of the wall had been built 200 years before the time of Christ. Whole civilizations that do not know anything about the Savior and never find out as year after year goes on end and one generation comes and another generation goes. Oh, I know it's true that through the church, Europe became Christianized. But I think of those 300 years of persecution, when people were taken and they were thrown to the lions and they were killed in so many barbaric ways. And many of God's choicest people cried up to the Lord and said, God, where are you? Deliver us. The heavens were as silent as brass. Things happened during those days that would be enough to bring tears to a rock, and God didn't intervene. And after that period of time, of course, the church begins to collapse into traditions as church and state are unfortunately united, and the true knowledge of God is again almost extinguished apart from a few groups. And then you have the Reformation, where people began to go back to the Bible again. But then you think of subsequent generations and you think of the heartache and the grief. The Soviet Union, where my wife and I were 2.5 years ago. 25 million people killed by Stalin. 7 million farmers in the Ukraine systematically starved to death, if you please. And then another 25 million people killed in the Second World War, and those two events were going on almost simultaneously. Can you imagine the heartache of the earth? And then we haven't mentioned China, where the United States Congress said that Chairman Mao killed 60 million of his own people in that revolution that ended up with the triumph of communism in China. And what can we say about North Korea and Eastern Europe? And you look at the history of the world, and how do you characterize it? Nothing really, except human